I'm Bob Crawford.
I'm Ben Sawyer.
And this is The Road to Now. Well, The Road to Now this week, Ben, takes us to the nation's capital. Our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Our guest today is Mary Clare Jalonick, Capitol Hill reporter for the Associated Press, and her new book that came out earlier this month is Storm at the Capitol, An Oral History of January 6th. Mary Clare, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thank you for having me.
Mary Clare, it's great to have you here today. You've put together something that I think will look familiar to most historians in the sense that when we teach, one of the things we always think that's important to do is to put together primary sources. There's what we say, but then we say to the students, all right, look, here's what I'm saying, but I want you to be able to see actually what was going on the ground, some of the evidence that I used to put together this argument. And one of the important things to me is to make sure that they see why people disagree, why people see things differently. And I think what you've done here is you have put together a source reader, I think, for January 6, 2021, that is well ahead of what most document readers are, and you've done a pretty fascinating job of getting different perspectives on it. So could you just open up by telling us your story? How did you come to do this, and what drove you to decide here just 5 years out to put all these voices together into one book?
Well, I really like that description of it, and I'm going to use that. So I was there in the Capitol on January 6th. I'm a reporter. I cover Capitol Hill and Congress for the Associated Press. And I have been covering January 6th since it happened. And an oral history really seemed to me to be a good way to get the facts out of what happened according to people who were there and witnessed it, from lawmakers to police to the rioters themselves to the workers in the building, staff, journalists. And, I think when you look at it all together as sort of a collective history, you do see there's kind of one consistent set of facts, even though you have different perspectives on it. Different people can debate the significance of it, but there is one sort of set of facts, and I think that's a really good way to lay that out in an oral history. I also had just a lot of, we kind of say we say things are in our notebook, right? Things that we have, interviews we've done that we weren't able to necessarily use all of, or so I had a lot of good interviews from people, and I spent a lot of time asking people what their experiences were on January 6th when I was interviewing them either about that or about anything else, especially lawmakers over the years. So, I had a lot of that. And there's also was so much material in court documents, other public records. So I just felt like there was a lot of material out there to kind of lay out what happened in the building that day. And so, I put it all together, and I'm glad that I was able to compile it.
You weren't just a journalist, you're a firsthand participant in an event that became a historic event. So what was that? Were there challenges, with you reconciling your own personal experience with the timeline and these firsthand accounts, be them public, court documents or firsthand, testimonials? Did you have trouble reconciling like the historical record of it versus the personal experience of it?
Well, actually, I think it really helped me understand my own experience. I'm a reporter. I'm like, I cover policy in the Capitol. I'm not really, I don't have like a national security background or a law enforcement background. And, what my experience was that day is I was in the House, and there were people, beating down the door trying to get in, and we were sort of huddled in the balcony, just sort of hiding while people were trying to get in. And I was with a bunch of lawmakers who were actually very unusually up in the balcony of the House because of COVID. They were spacing, and everyone had been evacuated off the main floor. But there was this sort of group of us who were kind of trapped in the gallery for a little bit. And we heard the shot that killed Ashley Babbitt, who was a rioter who was trying to get in downstairs to the speaker's lobby, which is right outside the chamber. And I don't think I fully understood my own experience until I really interviewed a lot of other people who were there. I was sort of in my own reporter mode, trying to take video of what was going on and not fully processing it. But then once, I did a story, this kind of what launched this in my mind was a story I did on the first anniversary where I interviewed a bunch of people who were also in the balcony and talked about that. And some of the lawmakers who were in the balcony um, formed a group, they called it the gallery group, and they had been talking all year sort of trying to process their own experiences of what happened. And it was really interesting to talk to them because there's a lot of people who did have security backgrounds. Val Demings, a Democrat who was the chief of the police in Orlando. Jason Crow is a former Army Ranger. Mickey Sherrill, now the governor of New Jersey, it was a former Navy helicopter pilot, or so. I mean, I think they all kind of knew what was going on. They could assess that there were rioters on all four sides of the chamber. They knew where the shot was coming from. They knew it was a gunshot. That kind of stuff I hadn't even really processed or thought about. And it was really interesting to me to hear what other people's experiences were. And so I think that, reconciling it to me was more just like finding out more about it and trying to understand what happened. Not only to me, though, in everywhere in the building. And I just feel like because people have downplayed it, and also because a lot of the focus, rightly so, has been on what was going on in the White House or, sort of the political aspects of it, that some of the experiences and some of the, sort of facts of what happened in the Capitol exactly were going to get lost. And so that's something that I really just wanted to know more about, and figured that people should know about its history, right?
One of the things I remember about this day was while I went down, I was outside of my house. I had very recently decided I was going to re-insulate a wall on the side of my house, and come to find out that the wall was eaten up with water damage and termite damage. So it was like the coldest day of the year, and I was outside essentially rebuilding the side of my house. And my wife came out with updates. She was letting me know what was going on as I was doing this. So all this to say is that, like, I wasn't watching beat by beat as this went down. I've then since gone back. So for those folks who were working or doing something else and don't quite remember it, could you just give us kind of a series of events? Because you do a great job of breaking this down kind of moment by moment. What do we know? What's the story? Just kind of in a quick narrative, so we can place the interviews that you're going to be telling throughout this episode.
Basically, there were, many rioters, or sorry, I shouldn't say rioters, and they didn't come to Washington as rioters. Like a lot of protesters, people came to hear Trump speak on the mall, and he gave a speech talking about a stolen election. He told, there's a huge crowd there, thousands and tens of thousands of people. He told them to march peacefully to the Capitol, but he also told them to fight like hell, or they weren't going to have a country anymore. And there was a wide variety of people there. There were not all people there intent on violence. There were people from extremist groups who had planned this and had, weapons stockpiled in a hotel room in Virginia. There were also people there who were just there for fun, or just because they believe they wanted to support their president. But a huge crowd marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. It got violent. They pushed past police and injured more than 140 police officers, broke through windows and doors, sent lawmakers and everyone else in the building running, and, evacuated the chambers where they were debating the certification of Joe Biden's victory, and, temporarily suspended the certification of his presidency. Police eventually pushed the crowd out after many hours, and they resumed the count, and they finished about 3 a.m. So that's the short story of what happened. But there is, that is like a set of facts that you can, is not debatable. It is, look at the stories of rioters, you look at police, you look at lawmakers, everyone is telling that story. But, some people have tried to downplay that and talk about it in a different way, as if it weren't violence, as if the police, were the ones initiating the violence. And, so I think it's really important to lay that set of facts out.
Ben shared where he was and how he experienced. This is one of those like where were you when events in our history. In my lifetime, I wasn't alive for the Kennedy assassination. That is another. It was the the Challenger explosion, the Challenger shuttle. That was a where were you when I was growing up. 9/11.
Yeah.
That is a where were you when.
Also working on a house.
So on this day, my daughter had a recurrence of a brain tumor in September. She went through treatment all through November and December. And on January 6th, we were at St. Jude in Memphis. January 6th was her MRI to decide whether or not we were going to go home.
Wow.
And it was COVID. So my wife was at the hospital. Only one of us could be at the hospital. So my wife is at the hospital with her while she's getting her MRI, and we're waiting for the results. And that day, I don't care who's getting the MRI or the CT scan, Ben. Like I know you've been through it. It's like that is like that for us is like the hardest stress that you can endure. And so my wife is at the hospital with her. We're anticipating, we're leaving Memphis this weekend. Like that was our like we're getting out of here. So I'm driving around Memphis listening to Sirius XM on the radio and the news. Oh, while this is going down, I'm running errands. I'm waiting for my wife to call. Like my heart's beating a million miles a minute in the first hand. I get home, I turn on the TV. I watch every minute of it.
Yeah.
And my wife's like, yeah, it was good. She gets home at like 6 o'clock at night, looks up at the TV. She's like, what happened? She's like, what happened? Like she like missed the whole thing because she's at the hospital all day,
Right.
Dealing with like our personal catastrophe. So the power of that day, it will resonate with those who experienced it, no matter where they were, no matter how they experienced, they're going to remember that day. You put out this book on January 6th. It is this historical record of firsthand testimony about what happened that day. The same day this book is released, the White House puts out on the White House website an alternate scenario for what went down. And it largely blaming, and correct me if I'm wrong, largely laying blame for the riot on the Capitol Police. Talk about the contrast and how you experienced, this is your book release day. This is a big day for you. And you're talking about this thing from morning till night. So talk about how you experienced the White House releasing that alternate history.
Well, I actually thought it was kind of interesting because they put out this entire, I hadn't seen like an entire timeline like that before, of this, as you say, sort of alternate history. And it was interesting to me to see sort of what that narrative is that people have been trying to put forward in a complete way. But yeah, the crux of it is, as you said, is that they peacefully marched to the Capitol and then, were basically attacked by the police, which is, I think, according to their own accounts, I think that's clearly not the case. There was also a hearing last week in the House. There's a new January 6th committee that is, investigating the investigators, basically from investigating the Democratic committee, also investigating the day. And there were several Republican lawmakers too who were sort of blaming the police and saying that they were, basically lying about the violence that day and the injuries they received. And I think that there's just so much evidence, not only in their accounts like that you can read written in my book, but also, I mean, if you just Google it, there are so many videos from that day. There is an incredible archive of video from every angle, basically, where you can see what happened. And, if you look at these trials, people acknowledged, what happened that day. Rioters did, So, I mean, there's really not any question that they violently pushed into the building. So, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to contradict that.
I think one of the powerful things you have here to add in is the testimony of the many people who went on trial as well. So you don't just have kind of what we're seeing, what we're witnessing, you have accounts of people who were there. who were talking about their events in their own words. Could you talk about how that fits into the greater story you're telling?
There's so much material. There were hundreds of trials, and in every trial, a lot of these people were prosecuted without going to trial, but in those that did go to trial, they had a lot of different witnesses to sort of set up the scene. So they would have police who testified in these trials. And then a lot of the rioters testified in their own trials. So there are just hundreds and hundreds, and, I'm sure in all thousands of pages of material of people's accounts of what happened that day and what they did. And it was just really interesting to dig in and find a lot of this stuff. Not only was there a lot of really good testimony from the rioters, but in terms of the police, like Eugene Goodman is a police officer who was in the Capitol, who a lot of people have seen the video of him being chased up the stairs by a group of rioters, and then he sort of diverted them away from the Senate doors, which is where like most of the Senate was still inside. And he testified in several trials, and he is actually he doesn't really like to talk to press. He hasn't really done very many interviews about his experience. He's kind of a modest guy. He doesn't really want all of the praise and attention that people want to give him. But he did testify in several trials. So I had hundreds of pages of his testimony, and which was really interesting, and it wasn't something that could be, obviously a lot of fantastic reporters have been covering all these trials, including our own at the AP, but you can only get a quote or two in an article. So just having that, volume of material to be able to really tell the story of what he was thinking and what he was feeling in that moment. Plus, like I had a FBI interview from Doug Jensen, who was the rioter who chased him up the stairs. And then I also interviewed myself, Igor Bobik, who was the reporter who filmed all of that. So, really being able to put all of those perspectives in one place was only made possible by, people testifying in trial and talking to the FBI and using those public records alongside my own interviews, which were around half the book. And then, the public records were around the other half.
I want to kind of go back to the personal side of it. There are two aspects that I found like fascinating in your book. That you're a Washingtonian, like you've lived in D.C. for a long time, you've worked on Capitol Hill for a long time. The morning of January 6th, before we knew exactly, we couldn't foresee what was going to happen. You were going to the Capitol, and you saw things that were just odd, just a little bit off. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, it was interesting interviewing people and having other people saying the exact same. Several people had this exact same experience. But I was just driving in like I always do. It was certainly had been a lot quieter driving in. There was very little traffic because of COVID. And but that day, sort of going in, I noticed there were just a lot of people on the streets. And I knew that there were going to be people there, but I realized when I was driving in that it was a lot bigger than I had realized. There were just so many people walking toward. I drive down Independence Avenue, which is one of the two streets that go alongside the mall toward the Capitol. And, as I was driving down Independence Avenue, I just saw there were tons of people on the streets. And, some of them, most of them just looked like normal protesters. It didn't look like anything violent at the time, but it did. It was a lot of people. And then when I parked and went in, there were big crowds already at the Capitol. And again, it was peaceful. There wasn't anything, going on that was violent at the time, but it was, there was a lot of like signs, like F Joe Biden and Stop the Steal. And there were like people selling merch, which I've never seen outside the Capitol. I'm not sure that's legal, but maybe it is. But, it was just really a lot of people. And so, but at the same time, and I think you see other people had this same thought. I still didn't think, oh, this is going to get violent. I thought, oh, it's just a lot of people. I mean, there's protests all the time at the Capitol, and we're just really used to that and used to maybe a scuffle or two outside or whatever, but it's just never anything that really has affected us inside. And so I still was very oblivious to the fact that this was going to be anything more than just a whole lot of people outside the building.
The other personal aspect of this that I still find just fascinating to this very after living with your book for a month is that your husband was there. Your husband is also a reporter, and so you guys both had different January 6th experiences, and you were in the same place. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, he was in a different press gallery. He started out in the house press gallery where I was, but he was wandering around sort of for a little while, and he has video of people banging down, the east side doors to the famous sort of Columbus doors in the center of the east front of the Capitol. He was sort of on a balcony looking over, and he has video of people smashing the glass and about to get in. And then he was on a balcony in Statuary Hall, which is a former press gallery because it used to be the House of Representatives. And so he was like on this little balcony on the second floor. There's not really a second floor, but a balcony over the Statuary Hall, seeing people streaming toward the house which is where I was. And so, we talked briefly. He called me, and we were sort of whispering. And I think one of the things I was like, we just shouldn't have, maybe I can't, or maybe I texted him that we both shouldn't have come in the same day, but that's not something we ever would have thought about before. It's not like, you think that when you're going to your job, it's going to be dangerous, right? So we briefly talked when I was sort of huddling in the house, and then he ended up in this other press gallery where people were walking by the door and like sort of beating on it while he was in there. So yeah, it was two really different experiences, even though we were not that far apart, and we ended up in the same place and we were evacuated. So that was nice. But yeah, it was a weird day. And my mom was home with our kids, and I was calling her saying, do not turn on the television, just whatever you do, do not, because my kids were home because it was COVID. So that it was just this, and she did not turn on the TV. I think she'd like run down to the basement and look at a TV there and see what was going on. My kids never knew until the next day when we told them. But it was just a totally weird day, and I think one of the most surreal moments of the day for me was when it was over and I walked back through the Capitol and it was just quiet. And there was like no one really around. And I walked back to my car and I drove home. And it was just so strange because that's what I would do on a normal night.
And was it
Um,
3 when did you leave?
yeah, I left a little bit before it ended. I think my colleagues were nice enough. I was like, I think I'm gonna go home now. I was like 2:30 in the morning and ended at like 3. I can't remember. It was
I-
just right before it
i-
ended.
Is there a
But
group like you talked about the gallery gang, and I have to,
Mhm.
is that bipartisan?
Well, the reason it isn't is because the only people that I'm aware of who were up in the balcony were all
Okay.
Democrats because they were spacing for COVID reasons. There just weren't any Republicans up there spacing. So it just happened to be a group of only Democrats.
Is there a similar group? Because that sounds like a trauma group, like a group that they get together to kind of like go through that day and process the experience of it and the trauma of it. Are there groups like that of reporters? Is there a group like that for reporters other than
That's
going
funny.
down, meeting down at the bar?
Yeah. It's funny that you say that because I was just talking to another reporter just when we were doing some, January 6th things and interviewed together, and we were like, we really should get together and talk about, but we haven't. I mean, not really as much. I think, sometimes we're just running around so much and trying to cover these things. And I think a lot of people haven't processed it. I mean, I think I've probably processed it more than most people because I've been writing about it for 5 years. And I, did this book. But I think a lot of people put it away and don't think about it that much. But yeah, no, that group was really interesting of lawmakers. They're on a text chain, and I ran into one of them just a couple days ago, and I said, "Are you guys still on the text chain?" And she said, "Yeah, we are. We're still talking all the time." And two of them just became governors. Abigail Spanberger and Mickey Sherrill were both up there and part of that group. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear their experiences and just sort of how they brought that experience into this sort of yeah, they would talk about it when one of some of them had PTSD from that experience. And I think one reason maybe it's even harder on the lawmakers, not that it's not hard on the journalists, But because there are so many threats against lawmakers now, and especially after January 6th, I mean, I can't remember if they doubled or tripled, but they skyrocketed threats against lawmakers, both sides, everybody. Like every single lawmaker gets death threats all the time now. And I think they live with that a lot. That, anywhere that, we've obviously seen a lot of incidents where people have been attacked or hurt. And I think when they were in that experience, that was like a familiar feeling to them that they might be a target, or that they are a target. And I think, naively, probably, nobody knows who I am. Nobody's targeting me specifically. And I think we feel as reporters, sometimes we're more in the background. And I think that's just not something that I'm thinking of every day, like they're probably thinking of every day, is that sort of target on their back from whoever it might be, who would, be horrible enough to issue a death threat against a lawmaker or, try to hurt someone.
In your book, you note that some of the people who participated in those events, they came to see what they did as wrong. Others, the stories have changed. I don't know if you read Jamie Thompson's story in the most recent Atlantic. I think it's called "Trump Doesn't Want You to Remember This" or something like that. I should know this. I narrated it for the Atlantic, but it was fantastic. But it's great. It's just, it's just in this most recent episode. And he tells the story of Tom Webster, a retired NYPD officer who comes down there at the time, believes he's doing the right thing. In the immediate aftermath, seems to have realized that what he did was not okay. But then his sense come to be ambiguous about it. And you see this across the spectrum. You see so many people. I know people personally who were appalled by this when it happened. And a few years later, we're right back. They had a different story that it wasn't that big of a deal, and we're again endorsing Donald Trump. And so I wonder if you, having done these interviews over the course of years, did you see any pivot points? Did you see any moments or events that seem to have influenced the change in narrative?
That's a really good question. I think there's just a lot, and it was different for everyone. I do think that we saw over the course of 2021, immediately afterward, as you said, everyone denounced it. Matt Gaetz was on the floor talking about Antifa, but even he was denouncing the violence. You know, a- there just wasn't a lot of ambiguity there. But then, we saw as the months went on, it really was maybe toward the summer, we started seeing sort of Republicans. There was a hearing where Andrew Clyde, the congressman, said, was sort of defending them, saying, you might have thought that this was a tourist visit if you looked at this video. And that just sort of picked up and kept going. And I think certainly as Trump became, it became more clear that he was going to be the candidate. And then by his campaign, he had some of the rioters singing, national anthem and that kind of thing. It really became part of the narrative that they were being mistreated and should be pardoned. So, I think it's just something that just continues to pick up steam, and we see new narratives almost every day. And I think in terms of the rioters, there's just such a wide variety of people who've had their own personal evolutions. Yeah, I do think that there's definitely cases of people who were contrite in court because they knew that that would help them. And then, now they've been pardoned, and, why wouldn't they try to defend what they've done, I guess. But then there are people like Jason Riddle and Pamela Hempill, both of whom I interviewed for the book, who tried to reject their pardons and have been very outspoken about saying, what they think they did was wrong. So, I think there's a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives, but I do think that the pardons would probably be I think there were a lot of pivot points, but I think the pardons were obviously a pretty big one.
What is the result of that? Like, how do the pardons kind of shape the overall narrative, for you of January 6th?
Well, it's funny because they happened right as I was on book leave and I was kind of finishing it up. It didn't really change the story for me at all. The book is a tight sort of, it's 24 hours, a little more than 24 hours in the Capitol. And it just doesn't change the facts of what happened. So, I mean, it did. I think it's important context, and I'm glad that it's able to, that it happened at time to be in the book, that there were pardons, but, which is just in the introduction, basically. But, yeah, it doesn't really change the facts of anything. And, the trial still happened. And we still have that testimony that people gave under oath. So, I'm glad that we have that record where people could, talk about exactly what happened, before all of the pardons happened.
Something that I thought was really interesting when, I opened your book, the epigraph, "Nothing will stop us. They can try and try and try, but the storm is here, and it is descending upon DC in less than 24 hours, dark to light." And that was a Twitter post from the account of Ashley Babbitt, who was the rioter who was shot by Capitol Police that day, trying to breach. I guess it was the House floor.
Yeah, it was the speaker's lobby, which is like, 2 feet from the house floor. It's like a door before the door that would have gone into the house.
Why for you does that quote kind of like kick off the book? Like what was it about that quote that made you kind of think that this kind of says it all?
Well, partially to explain the title, which was Storm at the Capitol. And the storm was sort of a QAnon theory. A lot of the rioters espoused QAnon, which was this sort of mysterious online figure named Q, who had said there was going to be this sort of reckoning, where Donald Trump defeats his political enemies, and that there was this sort of deep state cabal, and and so a lot of people were saying the storm is coming, and then obviously the storm came to the Capitol. So I think that was sort of, just to explain the title, and to also, sort of set up this energy that people had, and people who were coming there, and that they were really thinking that this was going to be kind of an epic moment, and really strongly believe that the election had been stolen, and that this was, their moment to stop that.
Looking at the story and how it goes down, and I think you did a good job earlier of saying, at the beginning you had protesters or supporters, and then many of those people became rioters. Not every one of them, but like many of them, they shift once they make that decision to violate, the Capitol building. There's some comments in here about, one on page 20 from one of the Capitol police officers. And he's like, you always got to be careful. We didn't expect it to be like this, but it don't matter if you got a right wing, group or a left wing group. There's always the tendency or possibility to turn into a hive mind type situation. And I wonder, reflecting on the way the story's changed and all of this, how much that hive mind, you see it on the ground. But I think you also see it, a lot of what's happened on social media. It's not just the spreading of conspiracy theories. I think it's, or alternative narratives or any of this. It's seeing people say them and then be approved by others. Your impulse might be to say this isn't good, but then you see other people doing it. And I wonder, when you look at this, how much you see that, or from another perspective, how many people who went into the Capitol do you think did it because of FOMO?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, I mean, I do think, I think that something that's really interesting is like the diversity of motivations, right? Like, there were definitely people who were there riling up the crowd, who were from extremist groups. We see Proud Boys sort of starting doing the initial breach, or sort of leading the initial breach, but there were other people there as well. And you hear a lot of people's stories of, oh, everyone was going, so they thought they'd go, or someone they were with wanted to go in, or someone they were with didn't want to go in. And the one that always kind of sticks out to me is Jason Riddle, who I just mentioned, who was wanted to reject his pardon, and he went in, and he just sort of thought of it as a party. He was like, it was euphoric. It was this sort of and he went, and they were ransacking the Senate parliamentarian's office, and he stole a bottle of wine, and he was a drinker, and he's like, just started drinking. And he stole a book called Senate Procedure, and he walked outside, and somebody bought it off him. And the guy who bought it off him said he'd just seen someone being carried out of the Capitol on, who had been shot, who I assume that he had seen Ashley Babbitt after she had been shot. And Jason Riddle was like, "Oh, no, 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 that's not violent in there. Everyone's just sort of, it's like a party." And the guy said, "No, I just saw this. They're shooting people." And he said he was never the same again. And he just ran. He said he like found the side, like he found like the perimeter and like just, you know, went along the perimeter until he got out and then he just ran. And so I just thought that was like his variety of experiences was really interesting because I think it shows that, he wasn't violent. He was just, he did break in and he was just sort of having a good time. He said he asked someone where the bathroom was, but then, he realized what he was doing was wrong. And I think he had another quote that was interesting to me where he explained both sides, where he sort of said, "I felt like we were being pushed against and that was wrong. And so, we wanted to push more. We just kept, we felt like that was wrong that they were pushing against us because we just wanted to get into the Capitol." But then he said, "But I realized, I was doing something wrong because I had moved past the barriers at that point, and I think that that really was like kind of the two perspectives of a lot of the rioters, really thought honestly in their minds that they were being attacked because people were pushing against them as they tried to push into the building. And then that made them more angry. And then, a lot of them had their own pepper spray and bear spray and things like that, and then were spraying the officers. So, and then a lot of them got more mad when they got sprayed. So it was just, this hand-to-hand combat that's just really like unimaginable. And certainly these police officers had not trained for anything like that. That's not like a battle, like a medieval battle is not like, just what they expect their days are going to have, so it really was just this like extraordinary situation. And I think there were so many different perspectives of people who were there and certainly afterward as well.
Talk a little bit about the timeline as it unfolded that day. 1:12 p.m., Paul Gosar and Ted Cruz object to Arizona's electoral votes, causing the proceedings to stall. Then 2:18 to 2:26, the House gavels out and gavels back in. And 2:38, Trump tweets, "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on our side, on the side of our country. Stay peaceful." 6 minutes later, Ashley Babbitt shot. 3:13, Trump tweets again for the mob to remain peaceful, no violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order, respect the law and our great men and women in blue. But he doesn't ask the rioters to leave. And then it's at 4:08, like another, 50 minutes later, Pence orders the military to clear the Capitol. Trump at 4:17, 10 minutes later, he must have got word because 10 minutes later, he posted a video asking his supporters to leave. How aware were you of those things, like with the tweeting and what Pence and Pelosi were doing while you were involved in the melee in the way in which you were?
Oh, not at all. I mean, a lot of that didn't even come out for like a year or so, I mean, a lot of that we didn't know. It really was like sort of a steady stream over a couple of years of reporting by a lot of people and the January 6th committee, the Democratic led select committee, that kind of realized a lot of that timeline. Obviously, we knew about the tweets and the public statements. And that was, just all sort of going by. I think that video, that was definitely like a pivotal moment in the day that everybody remembers. And some of the rioters say in their interviews or testimony, that when he asked people to leave, people were, talking in the crowd. Okay, he told, Trump says to leave. I don't know that everyone followed that, but it certainly seemed to be one instigator to, when it started clearing out. So, yeah. And one thing also that's like so crazy about the timeline that I didn't even really realize, and I mean, I did a little bit, but I didn't realize the extent of it until I put that timeline together, was how there was already violence outside. Like the first perimeter was breached around 12:50. And the joint session began at 1. So, the Senate was like processing, in their formal procession with the electoral votes across the Capitol going into the House. And there was already, rioting going on outside, basically. But there just wasn't enough communication or whatever reason, that it was another hour or so before, an hour and a half before the two chambers really shut down and were evacuated. So there was just all of this violence going on outside and just like totally oblivious inside from the lawmakers and everyone else.
Ben, I'm going to pose this question to both of you, Mary Claire and Ben. What would have happened if the electoral votes were stalled? Like if that box disappeared? Like constitutionally, they could not have affirmed election of Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, not good. That it would have been delayed no matter what, right? Like at its very basic level, it would have had to have been delayed because they couldn't have opened the envelopes and counted the votes. So I imagine that the states could have sent them back. Again, there's copies, and the states send several copies. They send, I think, now I can't remember. Maybe Ben. I can't remember how many copies they send to Congress, but they send them to the archives. So there are other copies in other places. So they could have gotten them together, and maybe they could have done that pretty quickly. But it would have been chaos, and it would have been then also opened it up to allegations of fraud.
There's the John Eastman, who was the gentleman who was Berger. What was his name? The gentleman who was charged in Georgia and actually admitted guilt. Anyway, he was with Eastman. I can't remember his name now.
Yeah, what they wanted to do was, just replace them with totally other ballots from these sort of alternate fake electors. But right, who knows what could have, there would have been so many questions if those ballots hadn't been saved. And people did get into the Senate after the Senate evacuated. So if the ballots were there, then they absolutely would have gone through them. I mean, there's no question they were going through desks. So, I don't know what they would have done with them, but if they'd been tampered with at all, it would have been disaster in terms of that day. So, that was just such an amazing move by the parliamentarian staff to grab that while their office was being ransacked around the corner, to grab those boxes. And I think, as I detail in the book, like some of the senators really were thinking about that as well and making sure that they were taken. So I think that's a pretty significant moment in the day.
Yeah, I think, I don't know procedurally what would have happened. It would have been one more plot point in a conspiracy narrative. Although at this point, I'm not so sure you even need it. A lot of good conspiracy theories come out of like sound evidence, and then hey, there's an incentive to do something differently. I don't know that we need that anymore for these. But, you get at this, and I just wonder if before we go, you had a minute to talk about, we hear these challenges, right, to the evidence you've presented. And I wanted to give you a minute to kind of say, what are the biggest challenges you've heard? Because, I'll go ahead and debunk one I've heard, which was that the whole thing was orchestrated by Biden's FBI, which I can debunk because Biden wasn't the president, Trump was at the time. So it could not have been the guy who wasn't the president's FBI. But for you, what do you see the pushback on? What are the major points? And how does the evidence speak to, to support your side of what you saw?
Yeah. And I don't feel like anything is my side except for just like the facts. And I think that's something that, sort of we've always dealt with at AP and other organizations as well, is like, we just keep trying to put the facts forward as we know them, in an unbiased way, in a definitive way. That's just, we try to just lay it out there and let people see that and then decide the significance on their own. I think all of those theories, obviously, I mean, we've over and over been able to lay out the evidence, and then people can sort of see what it is. And I just think it's hard, but it's also easy in a lot of ways, because it is just, it's what the facts are. And I think one of the things that I see in the Capitol, that I see as sort of a challenge, is that no one really talks about it, and it just gets kind of forgotten. because it has become this sort of like political thing to talk about January 6th. It isn't this shared experience that even though it is, because, so many of them were there, and from every party and, everyone in the building who was there. But people don't really talk about it. And, we've seen this with this plaque, that, the House, Speaker Johnson has sort of found reasons not to put up, that's honoring the police, that is supposed to be on the West Front. The Senate just, unanimously decided to put it up somewhere in the Senate. But
Okay, I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you about that.
yeah,
So can you just without please remember what you were about to say,
no, sure.
but
Yeah,
real quick,
it's part of
talk about the flag because I was actually surprised that the Senate put theirs up. So talk about the Senate putting theirs up, like what the plaque represents, and the Senate actually hanging the plaque versus the House not hanging the plaque.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's not supposed to be in either side. It's supposed to be one plaque that's on the West Front. It was a 2022 law that passed easily, that there should be a plaque up in the Capitol honoring the police officers who fought. And then it just kind of disappeared and it just never went up. Republicans took over the House in 2023 by the time the plaque was ready. People didn't know where the plaque was for a few years. Apparently it was in like, I don't have this confirmed, so I shouldn't say, I think it was in like a basement or something. But then Speaker Johnson just said recently, oh, well, it doesn't really work. It's not really implementable, I think is the word he used. There's too many officers to put their names on it. He's sort of found reasons to not do it. And then last week, on the week of, or I guess now it's 2 weeks ago on January 6th, they put up the Senate, Tom Tillis sort of raised this, that the Senate should put it up and no one objected. So they passed that by voice vote, which if one Republican senator had objected, then they wouldn't have done it. But they did. And I'm not sure exactly where they're going to put it. I also don't have this confirmed, but someone was saying that they have to find it now. I'm not sure if that's true. But anyway, they are going to put it up. And that's significant. That's really interesting. And I that also happened the same week that the White House put that narrative up. And I do think there was some frustration over that narrative, even from Republicans, and who don't always say out loud what they're frustrated about, but sometimes finds other ways to push back. And I think that's pretty interesting that went through with no objections. But it is all part of what I was saying, which is just that it is sort of a fight by people who want to remember it to remember it, because there's a lot of people who are trying to sort of downplay it, and it does get kind of forgotten. There's not a lot of signs of it. There's no plaque, there's no evidence of it in the Capitol, really. If you take a tour, I'm not sure you're going to hear about it. So it's just, it is something, and that to me too was a really important reason to write the book for history, to not forget what happened in the Capitol that day, whatever you might think the significance of it is. It happened and it's history. And, I think it should be recorded. And I certainly have like sort of a fantasy of continuing to do this, as people maybe will talk about it more as the years go on. I would love to update it at some point. I don't know that I will, or if there'll be that much to update, but I do feel like this is only a slice and there's, so many more experiences to record.
Well, for that Capitol gang, the pressure is on Jason Crow and Val Demings to become the. With Jason Crow, is he Missouri or Massachusetts?
Colorado.
Colorado. Oh my
Colorado,
God.
yeah.
And Val Demings, of course,
There's a lot of them.
Florida. Of course, Val Demings is.
That's
Florida,
right.
so-
Yeah, she is no longer in Congress, but she's still around. I saw her the other day. So yeah, there's a lot of them. Yeah, and a lot of them were sort of newer members, and yeah, we've seen two of them go on to be governor. So yeah, it's an interesting. There's a lot of experiences to record, and I hope to keep doing it.
The book is Storm at the Capitol, an oral history of January 6th. Our guest has been Mary Clare Jalonick. I just want to say, for everyone who's been listening to this episode, I hope you've heard a measured discussion of this. And I hope you recognize that what Mary Claire's trying to put together here is sound evidence, that the book is free of politicizing, it is free of moralizing. The book is an attempt to put together the evidence. If you're listening and you're saying, I don't know who to believe, well, maybe don't believe who, it might be worth believing the evidence. And there's a variety of voices here. I hope that if you're wondering what happened, you turn to this book, because it is a good source put together clearly with the best interests of the public at heart.
Thank you. You said it really well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Gary Fletcher, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.